Hello everyone, I'm going to get started now, and this webinar today is all about prioritising and getting buy-in for L&D programs. Now, despite the fact this is about L&D, it could also be about any enabling function, as it's called, because sometimes I've found, certainly in my career, and my clients have found, that when we're not directly responsible for selling or creating sales, our functions are called enabling functions. Still very critical. Business partnering, very, very critical. However, sometimes our programs can almost get deprioritized in terms of short-term objectives, which is always a risk, because that means that longer term vision and some of the course corrections we need to make in our function just don't get made. So then we can miss the mark and miss where the competition is going. So for the next 30 to 45 minutes, I'm going to walk you through some techniques, some tips through my own personal experience, having worked in government affairs, communications, and as part of the communications team, I was responsible for internal engagement, internal communications, and working as part of or aligned to the HR team around recognition programs, engagement programs. So I understand some of the challenges that you may well be going through, and I'll share some case studies as well. So really, this is a webinar, a workshop for you if you are an HR or L&D professional or part of a team who wants to know, well, how can I better my chances of getting support for my programs? What is it I need to do? Now, in many cases, it might just be degree shifts, and we're going to talk about those today. Or do you want to learn how to do this in the future? How you can look back, review some programs perhaps that didn't work as well, and think about, well, how could I redeploy them? How can I get that buy-in and that thumbs up and that yes for my programs? And if you're currently facing challenges, this is definitely a workshop for you. So let's get going. Now, there is an option to book a call. There's a link at the end. If you feel you have any further questions, or there's a particular circumstance that you're dealing with at the moment, because each company is unique, it has its own culture, then book a call and we can spend 30 minutes on the phone, no obligation, just brainstorming and talking through your particular challenges. So that link will be shared throughout the presentation. My diary is getting really busy. 2025 seems to be getting off to a flying start, so make sure you grab your space early. So what are we going to cover? We're going to cover how we can demonstrate impact and ROI for our programs. That is return on investment. I am sure that is a word, an acronym that you hear a lot of within your companies. How and what you need to do when presenting for buy-in. It may well be that some of the techniques I share with you, you've already incorporated into your programs, but it may just be how you're communicating. And again, I'm going to share an actual case study of how I helped a client with this. How do you demonstrate the impact of your programs? How do you regularly communicate the impact of what you and your programs do for the organization? Notice that last point, regular communications, more on that to come. So before we go into some of the areas that I've just talked about here, what we're going to cover together today, I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've heard, that I've seen from my clients when they're facing that challenge of getting buy-in for their L&D and development programs. Now, you may not be in HR, you may not be in L&D, you may be, but you might be in a smaller business where you really want to grow your team. You want to develop your team. Perhaps you're too much in the day-to-day and you realize for your company and your department to grow, you need to step away and have that more strategic vision and have a plan to grow your leaders and your management. So yes, you may well be in L&D, but you might be in another department or division where you really want to get your development program across. And this is something I help my clients with all the time. So let's think about this. And some of these you may well have thought of before, but I'm going to add some case studies and some further points of how you can really bring these points to life. Alignment with business goals. Now, this may sound obvious, but I have, through my professional career, witnessed programs that, whilst I can see the benefit, others may not, because it doesn't really align to the business goals. It's a good idea, but unless you can demonstrate exactly how your program aligns to business goals, they will be seen as, well, it's a nice to do, it's not essential. They must be an integral part of strategic objectives. And I'm going to demonstrate and share with you some techniques to do that. And if that's something you're struggling with, then get in touch and book a call. Now, let me share an example from my own career. I've worked in government affairs. I worked in logistics and supply chain, and I've worked in pharmaceuticals for many, many different companies. Now, government affairs sometimes can be a longer term program. And there was a particular initiative that would really help the company save money. I talked about it with my line manager and a couple of people, and they weren't quite getting it. So I thought, right, I really need to focus on the numbers. I really need to focus on the language of the business goals. Now, whilst this isn't L&D specific, this is an example of working in a function where you probably know how much of an impact your initiative, your program can make on the company's success, on the organization's success. So you need to make them really, really integral to the strategic objectives, maybe even some shorter term objectives if that's possible, to the business. Sometimes I find as well that many of my clients have issues with resources around the development program. For example, when they're speaking to different departments, the question might come from a departmental leader, an executive, another senior leader. Well, I haven't got time to do this. So how can we make this easier for our colleagues in different departments? And have you got the time, budget, and tools to implement the initiatives you want to implement? We need to think about this up front. What have you got that exists already? If you're working in a large organization, do you have tools that you can use locally or regionally? Or do you need a pair of hands to come in and help you? Very often that's where I come in. For example, in small to medium-sized businesses, there might just be one HR person, one L&D person, and I'm that pair of hands that can come in, help, do the heavy lifting at a cost-effective price, at a cost-effective budget. I'm very agile, very swift. I've been in your shoes, so I understand some of these challenges. So do get in touch and book a call if you'd like to discuss that with me. Sustained engagement. Remember, previously I talked about ongoing communication. We need to think about sustained engagement. How do we get people to actively champion our programs rather than just going along with it? That's super important. And ideally, how do we do that before our key presentation to the board, to senior leadership? There are ways to do this, and I'm going to come on to that in a little bit. This is often the reality. This is the reality of what I've seen and also what I've experienced when I've been presenting to boards, senior leaderships, and I've seen other people present. And I've thought, oh no, I'm not sure how this is going to go. Is it going to really be successful? Or, without wishing to judge, I've seen plans put forth and there's no numbers. They're not using the language of the organisation. It doesn't stack up to the scorecards. Some organisations have scorecards for different departments for their overall business, or a dashboard. We need to really think about those things. Ask yourself an honest question. Are you really reflecting the critical priorities and language of the business? It has to align. Now, sometimes for some people, for some of us, we might get really aligned to an idea. We think it's a brilliant idea. We're very creative, but sometimes we do have to ask ourselves that difficult question: does it align to the priorities of the business? Does it align to the language that we use internally? Are you bringing key stakeholders into the planning process? Remember, as human beings, very often we do not like things being done to us. We like to be engaged. We like to feel heard, listened to, consulted. We need to be inclusive, because if we include people early on in the planning, we not only build relationships, but we get that advocacy from across the business to influence the board, to influence the leadership team. I'm going to share a government affairs example. I was working with a company and I had to go into Westminster to present at an all-parliamentary committee, and I knew it was going to be a tough meeting. I knew I had a plan. Now, I know this is externally focused, but it does give you an example of advocacy. Now, I knew there was going to be a couple of people there who weren't bad people, but weren't really aligned with what private sector wanted to do. What did I do? I built relationships with them. I allowed them to see that I was someone that would listen, that would adapt, would take on their feedback. And guess what? During that meeting, my enemies, that's quite a strong word, turned into my allies and were defending me in that presentation. So if I can do it in Westminster in front of a bunch of MPs, I'm sure you can do it internally. So that inclusion is super important. Get that alignment. Think about this question. What's in it for me? If I'm in HR and L&D and I'm talking to engineering, what's in it for me? How can you use the language that an engineer would understand, for example? Broad generalities here, but you get my point. How would I use language and methods that an engineer would understand to get that buy-in? Is there somebody where I've already got a relationship who really loves development and I can align with them to really get that support before I get into the boardroom, before I get into that meeting? Are you seeking input on every aspect? The getting the feedback, also the topic, the formats, the timings. You may well find that you think you've got a great delivery mechanism for your program, but actually something comes up. Well, for example, well, in sales, for example, half of our team is now going to be working completely remotely. So how do we do that? They're working with a new bunch of clients, a new cohort of clients who work in a very different way. So our timings need to change. Businesses shift all the time and we need to shift with it, particularly when we're looking at L&D and development. What are some of the other distractions? What are going to be some of the other possible objections you might get from different departments or your leadership team? Usually it's about time, usually it's about money or budget, or there's some unanswered questions there. If you're getting objections, there's an unanswered question there. Well, how does this make an impact in the next year, for example? That might be a question. Get to know people, get to understand the typical objections. And if you need any help with these, get in touch, book a call, because believe you me, I've been there myself. This is also the reality that I see with my clients: testing, pilot programs. And this was a big learning I had early on in my career. I was at board level at quite an early age. I was very driven. I had a career plan. I had a career path, and I had a really great CEO. And he was very much into promoting people that demonstrated certain values. And I must have done that because I was on the board quite early on in my career. And I used to go in and present a program as though it was fait accompli. And then actually I realized we need to test it. We need pilot programs. A well-executed pilot from concept to pilot encourages further investment. Try not to take on the whole world first. Start small, see where you get to if you are getting objections around budget, time, etc. Look at your program as a cultural investment. Culture is so important. Culture is about how things get done. Culture is about so many different endpoints and criteria. Try and see how, even if you're starting small, you can use this as a starting point or a continuation point for developing a culture of learning and development. How does this investment align with employee well-being and future-proofing the workforce? What is it you must do? What is it that is nice to do, but will really embed that culture of, for example, agility, that culture of healthy challenge? Sometimes that's an area that I don't see a lot of in companies, and it ends up being a conflict. You might want to encourage that. So perhaps you want to have a program about how to understand your conflict style, how to understand the conflict style of another type of person or style of person, how you work around it. because believe you me, if you resolve those problems, you will be saving the company millions in terms of people not leaving the company, people staying, wasted time on conflict. So that's an example there of something that can really breed a culture of healthy challenge as part of continuous learning, continuous development, not just on technical skills, but on those wider skills that we all need, particularly when we're working with other departments. And I've talked about consistent communication. Keep in touch with your stakeholders, keep going back to it, follow up, get that data. So consistent communication as well as early engagement of stakeholders is super important. Here I've got some client reviews, and I'm going to share some case studies in a moment of people that I've helped with leadership programs. They're in different departments in the business, or the CEO of a company that wanted to really bring in a learning and development program. So here's some examples. You can find more on my LinkedIn profile, on my website, and I've got case studies that you can see at the bottom of my website. And again, if you've got a very specific situation, which I'm sure you have, then get in touch, book a call, and we'll discuss it in confidence. Now, my journey. I've already shared some examples about my journey, my career path. These are some of the organisations that I've worked in. Very, very different cultures indeed. My role was in public relations, engagement and communications, and some of that time I spent in the HR teams, redeveloping programs, redeveloping a recognition program. I worked in pharmaceutical logistics, and I spent about 25 years in pharmaceuticals, where I was constantly involved in short-term planning and long-range planning. Now, I'll give you an example. At one company, they realised that they'd done a pulse survey, and good for this company, they actually followed up on the feedback. Nothing worse than feedback not being listened to. If you want to demotivate your teams, do a survey and don't follow up, and don't tell people what you are going to do and what you're not going to do. So there was one area that was really quite low, and that was recognition and reward. People didn't feel that in Europe, Middle East and Africa, there was as much recognition for the hard work that they were doing in other countries, other markets, and perhaps even in the global organisation. They weren't getting that share of voice. So we took the problem, and that project was given to me as part of the HR team. So I conducted interviews with people, understanding across different cultures what works for them. And actually, what we also found is that people weren't getting enough time together to network with other people in different regions. So I thought, aha, how can I combine this? So I developed a program. I worked with HR to make sure it was in line with policies about how we could increase recognition, how we could increase collaboration and that feeling of being a team together, but also make sure it didn't have too much excess budget, that it didn't cause too much extra time. So of course, it was obvious, bolt it onto the end of a regional team meeting, but make sure we're giving time for recognition. So we designed the program, absolutely loved it. Within about 6 months, our recognition scores had gone from 5 to 40%. And that wasn't just a yes or no question. There were different questions about, what do you feel about the program? How do you feel recognised in our part of the business? What can we improve? And that was something we continuously improved. And the same with onboarding. I work very closely with my HR counterpart in Europe, Middle East and Africa, and the global team to make sure I was pulling in the resources that they may have as well. Same results with the onboarding program, but we tested it first. We got insights, we spoke to people, we had benchmarks, we made it very manageable. So we didn't have 50 slides in a presentation. We made sure it was very clear about the objectives for the business, how we were going to measure it, some of the feedback we'd had already. We even shot some videos. So both of those programs, in terms of onboarding people into that regional organisation and the recognition, really took a jump. And I absolutely, it was lovely to work, and it was great to see that difference. There's nothing as rewarding, is there? So if you'd like to see results like this, then get in touch, book a call. Again, here are some of my clients. And now I'm going to share a case study. What I've found sometimes is that when we're in a company where they are growing rapidly. For example, in this instance, tech, I've worked in fintech, I've worked in biotech. They have a great product, and all of the energy is focused on getting that product developed, packaged, and then to start selling. And that requires very specific skills and knowledge around the product. And you might have leaders, but the leaders I've sometimes found can be very, very functional and not people leaders. And that leads to silos, poor cross-functional collaboration, and actually employee burnout because, with the greatest respect, they've not really had any development. They've been so focused on, right, we've got this funding, we need to get to the next stage, we need to focus on doing. Their heads are down here rather than sort of looking at the wider road ahead and how to bring people along with them. So the learning and development team were really struggling. They weren't getting buy-in for L&D programs because it was quite a new area for the organisation. I think on some level they knew it was important, but they were so busy. It was like, well, I'm not sure if it's critical to where we are at the moment. But the HR team could cleverly see the rate of growth. And that's where you can lose people along the way. So what I did is I worked with the L&D team not to design a leadership program, but get that executive buy-in because that was the struggling point. Now, I didn't in this instance present to the team, but I worked on a program where the L&D team and the HR team could really shine. And it was a super small team, and the super small team were just dealing with the day-to-day, much like the rest of the business. How do we get people from being functional leaders to people leaders, and then we can start to grow the other people that are managers? We framed it as a business imperative. We identified leadership gaps, and we aligned where those leadership gaps would actually have an impact on business outcomes. For example, we looked at time, where people were spending time, where leaders were spending time. And we realised that if we extrapolated that number, that wouldn't be possible in the future. So they had to become people leaders and let other people, their managers and their teams, take more of the workload. So we could really measure that. And we looked at the cost of poor leadership. We looked at turnover because people were starting to leave. And of course, that costs money to replace people. We don't want that. We want to create a great culture where everyone feels engaged and productivity and performance is high. We used a data-driven business case and we engaged senior leaders directly. I actually did do the discussions because sometimes I found that from being outside the organisation, I can be someone that seems to be a bit more objective, and when it's framed in the right way, people actually really enjoy being open about their challenges. Perhaps they don't feel as comfortable sharing that with internal colleagues. That's certainly my experience. So we closely identified the leadership challenges and we worked with them to get some passive but some approval for what we were doing. We kept in touch with them to get that ownership and advocacy. So I conducted those interviews, and then HR and L&D continued that relationship. And we thought about how can we get some quick wins? This is a fast-moving company, it's a tech company, quick win. So we undertook a pilot program, as I've just described here. These are the results. I won't read through them all, but you can see that there's some significant results. So there are ways in which you can really quantify and get buy-in to your program. And now, as the company grows, this has become a core program. So if you think about the beginning, the couple of people that were in HR and L&D were just overwhelmed. They didn't have the headspace to think about, how do I get this across the line? They got in touch with me as a pair of hands to help them as an objective sounding board, and I designed the program for them, got their approval. They worked internally to get that early buy-in, and now it's going really, really well. And if this sounds like you or something similar to what you're going through, then get in touch and we can talk about how we can make your program a success. Now, there may be other things that are getting in the way. And again, these are some of the areas that I've seen in businesses that I've worked with. And in fact, I quite often post anonymous case studies on LinkedIn to talk about how I've helped people in these specific areas, because it might be about communications. it might be what you consider to be a conflict, and conflict can be a scary word for people, but it might be a misunderstanding. If you're working across cultures, particularly, is it a misalignment, a misunderstanding, and it's grown? Do you feel really uncomfortable when you get that resistance to your programs? Do you sort of freeze? Do you get into a bit of a challenging discussion? Or do you just sort of give up, really? And a lot of that's aligned to how do we manage upwards, but not just upwards, but across the organization. Because sometimes, particularly in larger companies, I've worked in big pharma, and that visibility, presence, and managing upwards, sideways, and across the organization is quite challenging, really. So how do we use the company's language, measurements, scorecards, dashboards? Are we using the language of the organization? And I think I've got a case study which is going to illustrate these points as well. How do we build rapport with people? Are we worried about presenting? Is there something perhaps in ourselves where we've not uncovered our blocks to speaking up and presenting? Are we using a one size fits all for presenting? Now, I'm doing that at the moment because this is a workshop, but if I was in a room with about 8 to 10 other people or a small group of people, I'd be adapting my style, still being authentic, still being myself, but to really respond in a way that other people would understand according to their style. So sometimes if we're using a one size fits all, it's like square pegs and round holes. Sometimes that doesn't always work. So we need to adapt to the personalities and behaviours in the room. Conflict I've talked about, and also dramatic tap of the desk. Is our ego getting in the way? And I'm not suggesting that you've got a massive ego. However, when people push back to us, we can feel a bit dented. Now, I will say there's a right way and a wrong way to give feedback. And very often I see it being done rather clumsily and in rather an awkward manner because people feel difficult about it, or people just think, well, I've got to say something bad because I've been asked for feedback, or sometimes it's delivered in quite a brutal way. So I understand that, and I understand that can be challenging, but sometimes do we get a bit upset or a bit sort of stopped in our tracks because we think we've got the best idea since sliced bread, but not everybody around the table thinks so. And don't forget, when you're in a meeting, sometimes, particularly at that senior level, there will be people in that room who always want to be heard, who always want to challenge. You do get people who are why thinkers. Or why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And there's nothing wrong with that. As long as people are being respectful towards you, people will sort of say, well, it's their way of thinking. It's how we all work in different ways. But sometimes our ego can get a bit bruised. So sometimes we kind of need to leave the ego at the door. I know it's difficult, and it's just about dealing with our feelings and our thoughts in the moment. Is the business direction unclear? This is an absolute classic. I've seen it quite a lot with emerging companies where actually, when you're presenting a program, and you may well have taken some of the steps or all of the steps that I've recommended, however, what it brings up, what your proposal brings up, is a clarity that our business direction and focus is not clear. Now, that can be challenging because you might get lots of conflicting discussions and debates in the room, but don't take it personally. Sometimes it's a sign that the business direction and focus is unclear. And that would suggest to me the whole leadership team or the board, you need to have a strategy session to really make sure you're all on the same page. And again, that's something I help companies with. I facilitate and host workshops. So if that's something that could help you, then get in touch and book a call. Are we just overwhelmed and busy? We're just overwhelmed, we're busy. I've talked about that before. I'm sure you are. There's lots of demands, and we could be focusing on the short term. Perhaps there's a particular person in your organization that's very driven, quite dominant personality, and it's like, oh, better respond, better respond. But actually we're not responding, we're reacting in the moment. So we might be missing the mark here. You might be in a company, as I've mentioned in the case study, where there's no history of L&D. They might think it's a good idea. Yeah, I suppose we should do something, but there's not really that understanding. So I found this when I was doing some work in the recognition programs, but also I found that when I was working in public relations, corporate communications, government affairs, that there wasn't that history of this function existing before or having existed for a long time. So people didn't really get it. So I had to take my time to sort of help educate people, build the relationships, and sort of just take my time and be patient with it. I talked about the example with government affairs before. That was a whole new area, and it was like, well, we know we need to do it, but we're not sure why. Sometimes what happens is the organisation will suddenly hit a crisis or realise they're in a crisis, and then they realise the importance of L&D. If suddenly a whole bunch of people leave the organisation and they realise, hang on a minute, what's all this money? Oh, we're having to re-recruit people, we're having to pay contractors. So sometimes you can really shine in that moment of crisis to present your plan and say, this is how we can avoid that and mitigate that issue happening again. Sometimes successes aren't reported back. Sometimes we're a bit bashful and shy. Go for it. Just put numbers around it. And sometimes we have to recognize when we need to course correct our plans. We can get very fixed on a program. We might be so busy with the implementation, we might forget to seek engagement from people that attend our programs, to people involved in our programs, from people who we might be asking budget for. There might not be a central budget. It might be pots of budget from here. So do we need to course correct? We need to monitor our programs along the way. Here's another case study, and this speaks to probably some of these points that I've just shared. So I was working with a lady, really great. She had a new boss who was also was the HR director, but she actually found her own HR director quite difficult to influence in terms of before she got to the leadership meeting to present her strategy for L&D, she found she wasn't able to respond to the style of her manager, and it made her feel really overwhelmed. And actually, she's starting to get a bit dismayed, feeling a bit devalued, etc. So what did we do? We did a disc profile. We looked at her behaviours at work and how she works under pressure, because under pressure, we all behave differently. We undertook a coaching program. We rehearsed presentations. We did playing. We did filming around body language, rapport. We did some tough questions, Q&A. I pretended to be her manager. I pretended to be some other people in the leadership team. I sort of adopted their behaviours, and I would use rapid fire, quick fire questions, or I'd adopt the pose of somebody that sits back and doesn't really say anything because they're more reflective. And within that disc profile, it's absolutely fantastic. My clients love it because not only do you learn about your own behaviors, the light bulbs start going off in terms of, aha, this is what I see in other people. And it gives us a whole toolkit of how to work with other styles, body language, verbal language, non-verbal language. What other styles really fear? Why do they behave the way they do? And then you can meet them in the middle by adjusting your style, and just by practicing and practicing and practicing role playing Q's and A's. Her confidence score, it was pretty low when we started. She was like, Sarah, I'm at 20%. And I was like, oh, what does good look like in a few months? Okay, let's get to 80. And in fact, she got to 85. And her HR director said, I can see a real difference. And I'm bringing her into those meetings more, which was appropriate because this lady was closer to the programs that she was developing. So just by adapting our communication style, we can really work wonders in getting our programs across. Now, if you're interested in DISC, if you're interested in some support like this, then get in touch, book a call. Honestly, it's a game changer. I can't emphasize it enough. When I was younger, I had Insights profile, again, game changer. Don't just do the profiles, but we use them to make those course corrections and adapt and learn and grow. So, presenting with confidence. So we need to learn how to present confidently, even if you don't feel like it. I don't really like the phrase fake it until you make it, but you can still be yourself and adopt some poses and some strategies that other people use that you see that you like. And sometimes when we're not confident, we're like this, and people notice that we're holding back, we're frozen in the moment, then that doesn't really inspire confidence. And I know it's tricky. I know it's tricky for people that are a bit more introvert, who process more internally. There's nothing wrong with saying, could you give me a moment to think about that? Can I come back to you? And your business should really be making allowances or be inclusive enough to incorporate all sorts of styles. Linked to the business objectives always. Engage stakeholders early. I've talked about that. Follow through, check in with people, get those data points, take on the feedback. Remember what I said about leaving our ego at the door? That's something we definitely need to do. But remember, be focused, be specific, not vague. Be clear who this program is really for. Be clear when you're going into a presentation. This is who I am talking to. This is likely to be the way that they're going to react. Remember, you might have done some development, but many other people haven't, and we tend sometimes to just react in the moment. Just think about all those questions you might need to answer. Who's this for? What's it for? How does it align to those objectives? What language am I using? How am I going to measure success? How am I going to course correct? And does your plan, are you at the point now where you need this talent development framework, talent development plans, including many, many different areas of focus? Because sometimes senior leaders like to see that this specific initiative fits into the wider plan. So make sure you can do that. We talked about business language, the resources. It's great getting buy into a program, because if you follow these steps, I'm sure you'll be even more successful than you are today. But have you got the right resources? Are you going to be relying on, for example, L&D colleagues in different parts of the organization, in different countries, in different markets? Have you spoken to them about this? Have you spoken to your colleague in Turkey? Have you spoken to your colleague in Spain? Have you got that feedback and asked them and spoken to them about the fact, look, let's have a look, let's talk about what resources and time are needed, so consulting with the business rather than sort of throwing something at them once it's been approved by the board. So having those right resources, and you can bring people from outside the organization. I've found that being external to the organization, being an objective voice, it's actually been very, very beneficial, because I don't really have that history of experiences. I might understand the company and what it does, but I don't really have those biases that sometimes set in, whether we're aware of those biases or they're unconscious biases. And remember to test. If you're working across countries, test in one market, test in a couple of markets, see how it goes and report back. So again, is the organisation ready for L&D? I'm sure you're great at what you do. And remember that anything new can cause resistance, and not to take it personally, unless you've done something really, I don't know, disrespectful, which I'm sure you haven't. Is it just that it's something new? Is it just that this person likes to challenge in a meeting? And is it just you need to also learn how to deal with that feedback and see it as a bonus? See it as a bonus and see it as, well, actually, if I'm going to promote a culture of continuous learning, then I need to learn as well. I need to take on that feedback. Also, what I have found, also in organizations that work across many, many countries, is that sometimes your plan might shine a light on what's not happening locally, particularly if you're in a regional or a global function. And I'm not trying to do that to be negative, because everyone's busy, everyone's juggling many, many tasks, but sometimes there might be a resistance because locally we should have thought of that before. So that's where that advocacy and getting buy-in is really important. It might be the local L&D lead, or it might be the local business director, or the business leader, or the general manager who thinks, well, actually, we want to do it ourselves. We don't want anything from global. So working around that, and I've had to work with that as well, a very sort of different picture according to the market. There might be someone in L&D who's like, yep, great, ready to do it. There might be no one in L&D, and the general manager feels, well, I don't really need to do that. But if I do, we're going to do it ourselves. So partnering is really, really important. The questions we usually get usually fall into three buckets: time, money, unanswered questions. So think about that when you're presenting your proposal. And I've been through it. Don't get me wrong. I've worked with people, I've presented in front of a whole room of people, and I remember someone in particular, super challenging. Luckily, I'm quite, I don't know why I pulled the face then, but I'm quite extrovert, I'm quite robust, so I don't mind that direct conversation, but that's not the same for everybody. But still, I found this person to be negative. And I think I avoided him. This was very early on in my career. I avoided him, and that was the wrong tactic. What I did was I spoke to a couple of friends that worked in that market, and they said, well, this is how he works, the motivations. And over time, I just needed to spend time with him. I think he just wanted to be consulted because his market, he felt, was quite an important market. So that's something I learned. You can turn it around. Relationships can be adapted. And in those meetings, you might not do any speaking. You might be doing all the listening. 2 ears, 1 mouth, remember, use them in that proportion. So sometimes just by listening, that really, really helps. So you can turn it around. And if you're encountering resistance or conflict, then get in touch, book a call, we can work around it. Remember, business plans, sometimes we focus on execution. We don't often look at the alignment that needs to come beforehand. You might have this great vision for your program, but have you got the alignment before you execute? I always like to remember that this is from the DISC Work of Leaders report, which benchmarks your leadership style in terms of leading teams, in terms of leading projects against the most successful leaders in the world today, about 300 leaders. It's super important. It gives you a dashboard of skills that you need to build and skills that you're doing well already. So it's super helpful. So this is what we've covered today. And again, if you'd like to book a call, here's my link here. It's all in confidence. I'd love to hear from you. I always like to connect with my network and understand what the challenges are, to get insights, to make sure that I'm providing the best workshops and the materials and the programs that I can. But for now, I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you on one of my workshops soon. Have a great day.